From the Beltway to the Bible Belt, from Wall Street to Bourbon Street, from the Pacific Northwest to the Eastern Seaboard. This is the USA Transnational Report, exposing what's in plain sight. Our live look around the world as we round up and review the week's news and newsmakers with our panel of expert insiders, politics, counterterrorism, investigative journalism, finance, the law, and enforcement. This program presents views and opinions which center around our American conservative ideals, the ideals of our founding, rooted in love of country and the protection of our Constitution and our future generations. Now, here's this week's moderator, William Palumbo.
Good morning, and welcome to the USA Transnational Report. I'm your host, William Palumbo. I'm here today with Wallace Brushweiler. Good morning, Wallace.
Good morning, William.
Our co-host, Andrea Shea King, is still on vacation. We hope she's back next week. Before we get started today, we would like to thank our affiliate, AM 1410 KMYC in Marysville, California, and our producer, JJ McCartney, who you can find at jjmccartney.com. Before we get started today, tomorrow, of course, is the 15th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, and we're going to observe a brief moment of silence in remembrance. Okay. I know it's been 15 years. That was a day that certainly changed the course of history, changed so many things about this country, and in many ways we don't seem to have learned our lesson. Kind of on that topic, one of the parties that a court in New York held responsible for the planning and logistics for 9/11, that would be the state of Iran, was in the news this week when it was revealed that the Obama administration may have provided as much as $33.6 billion in cash and gold to the state of Iran prior to the so-called Iran nuclear agreement being signed. The facts on that are as follows. This week, Mark Dubowitz, who's the executive director at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, testified before Congress. He said that Iran received $700 million per month between January 2014 and January 2015. The Obama administration delivered $400 million in cash to Iran on January 17th, the day Iran agreed to free the American hostages, as everybody knows. Then the United States presented Iran with two more installments totaling $1.3 billion on January 22nd and February 5th. So that's a total right there of $1.7 billion, of course. It's assumed, due to the fact that the same restrictions were in place at the time of the prior payments, that the restrictions, of course, being sanctions and banking restrictions as a result of those sanctions, that these payments were also delivered in cash. Former Pentagon official and Iranian regime expert Michael Rubin called the payments, quote, highly irregular. He said, "There's no reason for it to be paid now. After all successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican, have delayed payments so as to avoid funding Iranian terrorism." Now, this is, of course, only the latest we've learned about money from the United States, which I would remind everybody is practically $20 trillion in debt. Money coming from our country to the state of Iran. In my opinion, the entire thing looks like an incredible bribery operation to get them to sign a nuclear deal, which we don't have any way of enforcing and they have no intention of respecting. But it just is, I'd say, one more nail in the coffin for the legacy of Barack Obama and his foreign policy escapades. And the rise of Iran in that region has given birth to a whole new set of alliances and geopolitical realities. So I thought that would be an appropriate way to remember what we are fighting, why we're fighting, and in light of tomorrow being September 11th, really remind everybody that we still have a lot of war to fight, a long way to go if we're going to defeat this enemy. Wallace, I know you have a particular interest in seeing Iran, well, I shouldn't say that, we all do, interest in seeing Iran crippled. What do you make of the Obama administration's payment on this scale, if the number really is in the billions, tens of billions?
But I suppose what the official excuse will be saying that it's based upon interest accrued on the money seized after the downfall of the Shah and the upcoming of Khomeini. So if you take this approach and you try to build up a case justifying this kind of huge amounts of money transferred to a potential, and not even potential, but a terrorist state or a terrorist sponsoring state, it's beyond my comprehension. I don't understand that somebody had the guts to do things like that. It's unbelievable, because that kind of money will now be used to shady organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, and other groups throughout the Middle East, throughout Europe, throughout Africa, throughout the Far East, as we see. And I don't understand how Obama has the guts to do that, and his administration, because, I mean, you're talking about legacy, but that's, in my opinion, it's a negative legacy. It goes down into the history books our children will be reading in 20 years, and hopefully that in 20 years people will have regained sanity and will start to see things the way they really were, and they really are today. So this is, apart from the impact, the geopolitical impact, which we see right now happening in front of us, it's the alliances, previous alliances are shattered and are replaced with things which even 2 or 3 years ago were totally unthinkable. For example, the alliance, intelligence and quasi-military alliance between Israel and some of the states in the South Arabian Peninsula. Because we could spend hours debating the impact and the end result of this craziness done by the Obama administration, and the future impact on world affairs, really.
Well, $33.6 billion. I mean, they talk about often the money that Obama or the administration is providing to Iran being used to fund terror, but a figure that large, you could use that to fund a war.
Well, even more.
Yeah.
It's destabilizing the entire political spectrum we are used to. And I see some of it is happening in front of our eyes and not being recognized by our administration, or at least not willingly realized and admitted.
Absolutely.
Today, that we paint Russia as an enemy, it's putting common sense a little bit on a stretch way. You cannot blame Russia on everything, from the hacking of the Democratic Party database and things like that. I mean, this is an easy way to deflect public attention from the real problems.
Well, I was just going to say, we learned about this, gigantic payment to Iran on Thursday. And on Friday, as I was observing the news, I have to work, so I wasn't able to watch the news all day per se, but just reading the articles that came up online and peeking at CNN and Bloomberg on television. The biggest news, in their opinion, seemed to be that earlier in the week, Donald Trump had made some positive comments regarding Russia, and the feeding frenzy on that was incredible. So Iran, which refers to the United States as the Great Satan, received perhaps as much as $33.6 billion in cash and gold, and yet somehow we're supposed to view Russia as the boogeyman. So we're just going to take a couple minutes and remind our listeners of some facts about Russia that they may not be too familiar about. Obviously, this is the largest country in the world. It's almost exactly on the other side of the world. It's tremendous. On one side, it shares a border with Belarus and Ukraine. It goes all the way through the Caucasus. It has a border with China, and finally, it even shares a border with North Korea. So this is an enormous, enormous country. I would say it is also truly a multicultural society. I mean, it really has ethnicities that span Europe, Asia, and the Far East. So this is truly a multicultural state. Obviously, the main religion in Russia is the Orthodox faith, Orthodox Christianity, but they also have a considerable number of Muslims, many of them who actually like being part of the state of Russia. At this point, as you mentioned or alluded to, Wallace, as the geopolitical situation in the Middle East has changed, Russia, at least in my opinion, now has a better working relationship with our former ally, let's say our on-paper allies of Israel and Egypt, for the very simple reason that Russia acts in its interest and the same similar interest as Israel and Egypt in the Middle East. Now, Trump got into some hot water when he dared, in his opinion, say that Vladimir Putin was a better leader for his country than Barack Obama has been for this country. To me, that's obvious. I mean, there's no question about it. On one hand, you have somebody who has gravitas on the international stage, does what he says he'll do, and has the respect of the people living in Russia and actually makes them proud to be Russian. On the other hand, in this country, I don't need to go over all the reasons why many people don't respect Barack Obama. And I was just going to add really just one more thing. In the West, it's very easy to kind of get wrapped up in our own rhetoric about many things and kind of view the world through, let's say, a very liberal or very Western lens. But we have to remember that the other side of the world, there's another pole, really, to politics, and that's the Eastern side. And the reality on the other side of the world is often very different. So while we sometimes struggle to understand why Russia or countries in the East do things or view things differently, we have to remember that we don't always share the same interests. Although I think what Donald Trump has put forward is the idea that we all have a common enemy in terrorism, in Islamic terrorism, and there are ways that the United States and Russia can work together and have a better relationship to defeat this common enemy. One final point here, a professor of, I believe, Russian history, Professor Nina Khrushcheva, was interviewed on CNBC this week. She said regarding the animus towards Russia and the United States, she doesn't know if the U.S. even wants to fix a relationship because she believes Russia is a convenient punching bag. Quote, in some ways, whatever Putin and Russia's problems are, the United States wants to have Russia as such a wonderfully convenient, big, scary enemy because it serves the purposes of many, many layers of American society. And I think that sums it up quite well.
I will just add one thing. As I said before, I think that here to paint Russia as a potential enemy just serves the purpose very diplomatically to deflect attention from other big problems which we're facing. And that means that people then will focus on that so-called enemy, Russia, and will forget or put aside the real problem we're faced with.
Well, there was a very interesting article written by, I think, I don't recall the man's name, but he's essentially the only Western scholar at one of Moscow's big foreign affairs institutes, very close to the Russian government. And he's there as kind of a guest. And he wrote an article and I don't have it in front of me, I'm just kind of going off the top of my head, but basically saying that why does Russia prefer Trump over Clinton? And what he was saying is that the remarks and the actions Clinton took when she was Secretary of State have convinced the Kremlin, really convinced the Kremlin, that Hillary Clinton wants to start a new Cold War. The way that she went about criticizing the Russian government for their human rights record and saying they're anti-women, and basically labeling them all as neo-Nazis, they take this very seriously. And at least the way that the author presented it, this was in foreign policy, was that when a Secretary of State and now a presidential candidate actually goes on the record and calls the main force of Russia in the world, let's say neo-Nazism, obviously they're concerned about what Hillary Clinton may do, and it's a no-brainer for them. Of course, they're going to prefer a candidate who seems to want to work with them. Any comment on that, Wallace? Or
listen, I totally agree with that. You see, people should start to realize that, for example, the Russian army today has about 18 to 20% Muslims inside the Russian army. So Putin is faced domestically with a huge Muslim potential terrorist problem, and he's handling it. I mean, the press doesn't cover it very well because they try to block the news regarding whenever there is a problem in Chechnya. Chechnya is a part of Russia, and Chechnya, one of the main top man of the ISIL was a Chechen. That's the guy with the red beard. He got finally knocked off the scene recently, fortunately. But you see, it just shows the kind of problems Putin is faced internally, which people don't realize here in the United States, the magnitude of the problem he's faced internally. And he's, in my opinion, to a certain extent, I must say, he's handling that so-called problem quite well, which is not recognized here, or if it is recognized indirectly, it's denigrated. So you see, listen, he moved into the Middle East because we created that vacuum. We left totally. We don't have anything to say any longer in the Middle East. We're not taken seriously there. They just look at us like any other little state, like Switzerland or the Principality of Monaco. It's nothing to do. We don't carry weight any longer.
Yeah, and I would just, kind of thinking about. I apologize. There are some sirens going on in the background, but I think an ambulance is driving by. I know many people, you know many people. There seems to be a tick in some people's head where they can't say one nice word about Russia. But I don't know. I think that ultimately we do have common interests, and there is a way to work things out. On that note, I'd just like to remind everybody, you are listening to the USA Transnational Report, heard live every Saturday morning here on J.J. McCartney at 8 a.m., please visit our website, usatransnationalreport.org. Now, Wallace, I know you wanted to discuss some, let's say, something interesting that came out in the press yesterday regarding the head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas.
Okay, Mahmoud Abbas came out. I mean, the news came out and officially confirmed that Mahmoud Abbas in the 80s was a KGB agent based in Damascus, Syria. Mahmoud Abbas is an individual which had graduated from a university in Moscow under the Soviet, at the time of the Soviet Union, that university is now called the Lumumba University, and the notable graduates from there, apart from Fatma Abdel Mahmoud, the Sudanese politician, and then there was Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, the Judge Jackal, Ganesh Shah, the Nepalese politician and member of the Communist Party in Nepal. Then we had, obviously, Mahmoud Abbas, who is today the chairman, the PLO, and president of the Palestinian National Authority. He is faced with an election in the what you call the occupied territories. You have to understand that, and I'm not giving out any secrets. In the last couple of years, Mahmoud Abbas operates in the territories, in the Palestinian Authority, with the tacit help and protection of the Israelis. Now, the so-called future election, which should take place, and everybody is trying to convince Mahmoud Abbas to cancel that election, because everything shows that Hamas will win the elections. That means that if that goes through, we will have Israel will be faced with Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Hamas in the Western, in the Palestinian, in the territories. So that means it's practically impossible. The only solution which could potentially happen is that a gentleman who has been excluded from the Palestinian Authority, Dayan, who has fled to the Arabic Peninsula, he had let's put it mildly, a disagreement with Mahmoud Abbas. He is well regarded by Israel to a certain extent, if you can talk about well regarded of an enemy, but he would be a more, let's say, more acceptable figure in the territories. But you have to understand, Mahmoud Abbas today is a replica of Arafat, same corrupt, money-grabbing person. So, I mean, the Palestinians should be happy if he goes in silence. That would be lovely. But that is, I just got back and give you, Mahmoud Abbas was born in 1935. The Soviet Union at that time gave him the name, the code name, Kortov. And you have to understand, he was a KGB agent. He was not a spy, he was not a collaborator, but officially a KGB agent. That opens the question, and I think that some historian and strategists should look into that. It would have an impact on the creation of the Palestinian problem. Mm-hmm. Because we have to understand that having a KGB agent, I mean, under direct orders of Moscow, operating out of Damascus, creates there would be questions, should be asked, why and how that fits with the creation, because you have to understand the problem of the so-called problem of Palestine is an artificial problem as far as I'm concerned, and came to light practically after 67. Mm. So therefore, we have to start to ask ourselves, what did the Soviet Union have a finger into that whole problem? I will leave that, and I think that some historians and strategists should look into that a little bit deeper.
Now that's certainly fascinating. I mean, I know that obviously the Soviet Union was ultimately the force behind much of the terrorism during the 1970s and 80s in Europe. I know that, of course, really primarily from speaking to you. Do you think that today there's any remnant, let's say after the fall of the Soviet Union, all of these former agents, what do you suspect happened to them? Do you think they retained ties with the Kremlin, or do you think they were, their funding dried up and they kind of inertia carried them on to, let's say, new sources of funding, or were they already at that point able to continue on with what they'd created? I'm talking about the Palestinian issue.
If you ask me without having hard proof of that, but what I would say, gut feeling wise, I would say that the Moscow doesn't have a finger in it any longer. If there is let's say a power behind today's terrorism, I would strongly look at Iran, Tehran, and some ways indirectly being also helped by North Korea to a certain extent. That's
cool.
The way I don't see it any longer. Listen, it would be a nonsense that Putin would still, regardless that he was an ex-KGB, but he, from that moment on, I would say he changed totally. I mean, he understood. I think that Gorbachev did a good job to, let's say, turn Russia into some sort of a halfway decent, I said halfway decent entity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to remind everyone you're listening to the USA Transnational Report, heard live every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. on jjmccartney.com. Please visit our website, usatransnationalreport.org. To change topics a little, a bit away from politics and international affairs, there was something that came out in the news this week which, frankly, as a financial services professional, shocked me. In fact, when I first heard the headline, I wasn't sure if it was from The Onion or it was some fake news site. But no, this is actually true. It's reality. So let's get right into it. Wells Fargo, that is the most valuable bank in the United States. It has a market cap of approximately $250 billion. That means it's larger than other banks such as J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, you name it. It's the largest or most valuable bank in the entire country. Back in 2013, authorities began investigating Wells Fargo for what could be termed let's say, account fraud. This week, we learned that 5,300 employees, that's 5,300, were fired for creating accounts without customer knowledge. So what does that mean? Essentially what was going on were these client account managers were opening up different types of accounts for customers who had one account. So, for example, if you went into Wells Fargo to open a checking account, you may have had a savings account and a credit card account opened in your name without your knowledge. Now, with a savings account, that of course would have to be funded with something, otherwise you can't open an account with a zero balance. So what they were doing was taking money from the existing account which you authorized for them to open and moving it into a new account without your consent, without your knowledge. In total, they created more than 2 million false accounts. This included checking, savings, which totaled approximately 1.5 million, and another approximately 500,000 credit card accounts. Now, what's curious about this, what I would say gigantic scheme, if you want to call it that, it seemed to be almost a practice. Not really a scheme. It's hard to call something a scheme when it's 5,300 people large. The total fee income generated for Wells Fargo, according to this report out of Bloomberg, was $2.4 million. So 2 million false accounts, $2.4 million in fees. So that's, I think, works out to about $1.20 per account, which is spectacularly ridiculous. As a result of this investigation, Wells Fargo is being fined $185 million. The way that breaks down is the CFP, that's the Consumer Financial Protection Board, which is, of course, the new agency created by Elizabeth Warren and eventually Barack Obama, will get $100 million. The Los Angeles City Attorney will get $50 million. And the OCC, that's the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, will get $35 million. So you create 2 million false accounts. The total fine is $185 million. In the banking world, $185 million fine. Well, it's not nothing for something this scale. In my opinion, it's quite low. Now, where this gets even more interesting is that Wells Fargo, the largest shareholder in the entire bank, is Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett being I think now the second richest man in the entire world, funds all sorts of progressive causes, big Hillary Clinton supporter. He owns $100 million in personal stock in Wells Fargo, and his company, Berkshire Hathaway, owns nearly 10% of the bank, making it the largest shareholder. So, like I said, this is a fraud on a level that I actually thought initially was a joke, but no, it turns out Wells Fargo did create 2 million false accounts.
If I can add, I think that we are touching only the tip of the iceberg.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
Because I think I'm tempted to say the fraud is much larger. Here they had to come out because news travel fast, and they had to do something. So they presented, law enforcement presented Wells Fargo with the evidence of those employees, and so Wells Fargo had to react. The only way they could react is to fire them. But you see, they turned around and they said, listen, we are not law enforcement, so you build up your case and you go after those people we just fired and build up. And this is where I think then what we will uncover at the end of the day will be much larger than the figures you mentioned before. That's the way I think. Because I think that what they did, they used what is commonly known as the salami technique. That means that they took money without the authorization of genuine bona fide clients in amounts of $10, $15, $20. And people do not challenge statements where there is a discrepancy of $5, $10, $20. They let it go, and as long as it doesn't, it's not a repeat thing every month or every statement. It goes undetected and especially unchallenged. And this is where I think that the thing will, at the end of the day, will blow out at gigantic proportions. I think that Wells Fargo is in for a bad time.
Another thing that kind of strikes me is that with this scale of fraud, I just can't believe that the bank had no effective controls to be picking up on what was going on. I mean, there should be, let's say, monthly checks to ensure, first of all, that the client information is real. I mean, I saw in the Bloomberg report that they were using like email addresses, something ridiculous like noname@wellsfargo.com for a client account. There's an entire initiative, or let's say industry-wide push towards better KYC, which is know your customer, know your client. And such a huge amount of effort is being invested into developing more sophisticated programs to understanding the relationship that the bank has with its clients. and that 2 million false accounts were created does not speak very well of Wells Fargo's ability to control their operations. So I think you're right. It probably is the tip of the iceberg, because once they learn that the controls, or once they figure out that the controls in Wells Fargo are evidently so poor, they're going to have people breathing down their back every minute of every day.
Yeah, you see, in my opinion, the lack of standard procedures to check that is very difficult. And then once you, as you mentioned, once the other side realized that they can do certain things and get away with it unchecked, the whole thing mushroomed. Mm-hmm. And this is why I suspect, sincerely, personally, I suspect that the whole thing will blow out of what we know now. Those figures we're talking about now is just the tip of the iceberg.
Mm-hmm. I believe it.
It's going to be a major catastrophe for Wells Fargo, and in my opinion, it will reflect on the entire banking industry.
Yes, especially the American banking industry, which doesn't exactly have the best reputation in the world right now for many reasons, but primarily because we have it dug into a hole with all these, let's say, government regulations that aren't allowing it to function properly. And many foreign banks who operate in the United States are
complaining.
They're complaining that there's just too many things to comply with. I mean, it becomes unprofitable to operate.
Like you said, too many things to comply with. But at the end of the day, they can't even figure and block a very simple fraud. Let's call it what it is.
Yeah, no, it's
ridiculous.
It is completely ridiculous. Okay, well, we have approximately another 15 minutes left, and we had a number of other topics we'd like to get to. One of them concerns the Clinton Foundation, which is in the news regularly for a number of reasons, one of them being that a friend of this program, Charles Ortel, has been digging through their financial statements and really doing the work to prove that regardless of what you think about the so-called foundation, so-called charity's work, it's been operated in a very crooked manner if you just apply the laws to charities for a number of reasons. Of course, that documentary, which is available for free, Clinton Cash, also proves to most people who watch it, unless you have your rose-colored glasses on, that the Clintons use the Clinton Foundation to accept money for favors while Hillary Clinton was at the State Department. In some cases dealing with absolutely awful despots around the world. And somehow the Clintons have ended up fabulously wealthy, despite the fact that, as Hillary claimed, when they left the White House, they were dead broke. So there are a number of ways that this could be dealt with. In my opinion, it won't be dealt with by this Department of Justice, but assuming there is a change in power in Washington, Wallace, I know you had a recommendation as to how to deal with it, which was the appointment of a special prosecutor?
Yes, definitely. Because you see, you have to realize, as far as I can see, the Clinton Foundation became some sort of a personal Clinton's family piggy bank. Mm-hmm. That was ridiculous. I mean, 19 years in existence, and that started since before the end of Clinton's first stay at the White House, and has been accused widely of being a phony charity by numerous pundits, authors, and agents. You see, those. I mean, I'm sorry to come back always about those pundits. Those are the. Here we take what they say like gold. That they think that's the absolute truth. Those are the same people who predicted us that the Republicans would wind up with a candidate called Jeb Bush. And nobody retracted anything afterwards. Now there are some. Levine, for example, is the last one, which came around and they said, "Oh, now I'm willing to back Trump." It's a little bit late. You did the damage, you idiot. You see, and there, as you mentioned, I'm in favor of having a special prosecutor, because that's the only way to get through all that marasm of the Clinton Foundation. There's no other way to come to understand the magnitude of what they did and how they did it.
Well, the Clintons have a close history with special prosecutors, so what's one more in their life, right?
Yeah, exactly. But what we have to be careful is that we do not make the mistake in November and get Hillary in the White House, because then from that moment on, the whole thing will be sealed, and we will never be able to figure out what happened really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's absolutely outrageous. I mean, it's one of those stories that's so big, that's so sprawling, that it comes out in dribs and drabs, and I think if you take a step back and put the pieces together, you realize it's the size of a whale. We had a couple other little topics we were hoping to fill our audience in on. Wallace, I know last week we only got to mention briefly what the Obama administration was proposing in terms of international drone strike regulations and the repercussions that could have on how, I don't know, let's say the United States allies prosecute the global war on terror. Could you tell us what that's about?
Before that, I would just mention something also that we forgot to mention last time, that the government employees in the United States outnumber manufacturing employees by 9,932,000. And
wow.
This is according to data released 10 days ago by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Federal, state, and local government employed 22,213,000 people in August, while the manufacturing sector employed 12,281,000. So this shows where we are going. Now, coming back on the topic you just mentioned, you see, if the modern Western world wants to continue to fight terrorism in the future, this capability is essential. That was declared by Major General Yaakov Admirov, who served as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu National Security Advisor from 2011 to 2013. He was quoted as saying this by the Defense News. He said, from a professional point of view, it's important to understand there is no substitute for this capability. So therefore, to limit and rein in the potential use and capabilities of drones is, in my opinion, counterproductive, and I would say to a certain point in today's environment, I would call that practically criminal. You cannot block that thing. It has to go and has to be used to the full extent. And right now it's used unchallenged practically with great success. Some of it known and some of it unknown and will remain unknown. Mm-hmm. So therefore the thing to start to set up international drone strike guidelines, it just threatens the global anti-terrorism efforts.
Would that be judged out of the United Nations or some UN body? I mean, when they talk about global regulations on drone strikes, I mean, what if somebody just says, we're not following those ridiculous guidelines, we're just going to bomb this terrorist regardless of what the so-called rule book says? Who would even, bring these people to a tribunal? I mean, to me, it doesn't even make sense. How would you enforce it? Yeah. Sanctions?
No, I would sanction one thing as long as it remains outside of the sphere of the UN. But I suspect with Obama's tracking record that he would then, once it's accepted here and giving it an international flavor to it, he will try to push it through before the end of his mandate through the UN. And today the UN is a very, very weak machinery. That means to block a thing like that, because it's totally in the hands of, I wouldn't say, of people who have absolutely no desire to enforce, or let's say to protect humanity as such, which the UN originally, 1948 was, or 47 when it was created in San Francisco, was the final goal. But today it has been taken over by rogue states. For example, that Iran is part of the Human Commission. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. The whole thing, the UN is a burden, and I think that the best thing would be that we close it down and tell them to go to Haiti or whatever, and then New York has a nice piece of real estate.
Yes, and far less diplomats driving around breaking parking rules. So I know we're jumping back and forth to a couple different topics here, but you mentioned the number of government workers versus the number of manufacturing workers. They say we don't make anything in this country anymore, and it's not quite true. We make lots of bureaucracy and lots of regulation. But on a more serious note, I think that is an incredible statistic. I mean, first of all, the number of government workers is practically double the number of manufacturing workers. But to tie it into what is the one of the political topics du jour for 2016, Donald Trump, I think rightfully so, and with using common sense, which is so sorely lacking, has made it a point to say he wants to make things in the United States again. Whether it's technical machinery, whether it's high-tech consumer electronics, whether it's even clothing, whatever. It's difficult to consider yourself a real force in the world if your economy primarily makes intangible things, right? Like financial services, other services, professional services. That's great, and everybody needs them, and they're very valuable. But ultimately, you need something you can put your hand on at the end of the day. I mean, I was just thinking about this, in general. When people go to buy a car, or when they go to buy a very nice tool, for whatever, a piece of hardware, they might go and they might say, I want a German car because it's known for the quality. Or they might, when they're looking to buy a piece of hardware, some specialized piece of hardware, they might say, I want it to be made in Japan, or I want it to be made in Italy, or an appliance or something like that. But I was struggling to think what piece of consumer tools or consumer products in the United States do we make in the United States that really is the best regarded in the world. And I couldn't really come up with anything. I know many of them are designed in the United States, but in terms of where it's actually produced, like, for example, the iPhone is made in China. Many other tools have been outsourced. I'm not saying this, the factories in these other countries weren't built by American engineers with American-made capital, or let's say European capital machinery. But ultimately, I don't see very many things I buy stamped with "Made in the USA."
But I think you have to understand that, okay, with that, you see, Obama's administration and Soros particularly have pushed that globalization movement to the extreme. So you see, for example, you're talking about the iPhone. The iPhone, part of it was, let's say, designed and turned out in Israel, and then manufactured then in China or in Indonesia, things like that. You see, the globalization has a terrible drawback, because you see, and I'm coming to the nitty-gritty of the problem. You see what happened with the Samsung, with that thing that now explodes and burns. It's because the controls and the, let's say, the quality control of any gadget or any machinery, anything, is divided in multiple countries, and they don't always talk to each other correctly. So, for example, Samsung, I don't understand how they vetted and checked quality control-wise the producer or the manufacturer of those batteries. I'm sorry, it's a lack there, and Samsung is totally responsible for that. So you see, what you were saying about that, that you can't find a product which is entirely designed, invented, designed, and manufactured in the United States, you're totally correct, because I think that apart from that pillow ad we have on TV, there's nothing else which is designed and produced in the United States. I'm sorry to be that blunt.
A pillow, yeah. Well, that's not exactly going to get the economy roaring back. But a lot of people are sleeping. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's hope that does change. One other thing we were going to cover last week, we'll just mention it briefly here. A couple of weeks ago at this point, our friend Secretary of State John Kerry was caught, or I don't know if he was caught, he said it in the open, urging the press not to cover terrorism. Now, this sounds unbelievable because terrorism dominates the news cycle, but for a more, and in no way are we defending John Kerry in any way. However, it brings up I would say a fair point. Is there not that he was making that fair point, but is there a point to be made regarding the let's say the overabundance of coverage of terrorism in the news, and how can we think about that?
Listen, I would say that strong of the European experience in the 70s and 80s, Europe went through that same phase, that over reporting of and hammering for hours, days, and weeks on a single incident. It has to come because it creates, apart from everything, it creates discomfort, in quotes, at public level. And secondly, it creates, to a certain extent, the possibility of copycats. That's one thing. So there, Europe at the end managed to put pressure on the media, be it the written media, be it the radio and TV, and there was a happy medium found. That means, yes, an incident or an act or a terrorist act will be reported, but not day in, day out, practically 24 hours a day. That brought results. Because you see, terrorists, what they want is exposure. And the exposure we have to give them, I mean, in order to what we call a free press, freedom of information, everything you want, but not go on and on and on. For example, when San Bernardino or Orlando happened, TV was, I mean, just practically 18 hours on 24 were tuned on that and analyzed from every possible angle, which some were completely idiotic. Because,
well, we only have 60 seconds left here. I was just going to say, there's a big difference between reporting terrorism, linking it to the fact that it's related to Islamic terrorism, which I think John Kerry wants to avoid, and reporting on something like it's a soap opera, 24 hours a day for the next 7 days. I think there's kind of an obvious line between, yes, we're still under threat from Islamic terrorists, here's another example, and now we're going to report on the play-by-play with the FBI and what they're doing to figure out what happened, which, in my opinion, doesn't serve a purpose. But on that note, we are actually out of time for the week. The show went very quick this week, lots to say. Wraps it up for this week's edition of the USA Transnational Report, heard live every Saturday, 8 a.m. on cartney.com. Please visit our website, usatransnationalreport.org. Thank you, Wallace. Thank you, JJ. I'm William Palumbo. See you next week.
This has been a Nightside Radio Studios, JJMcCartney.com production.